Okay, I am joined by Peter Salib and Simon Goldstein remotely. We spoke a while ago, but it was so good. We're having you back. You've written a new paper called Liberalism Forever, which we're going to chat about. Thanks, both of you, for coming back on the show.
Anytime.
All right, well, let's just dive into it. Tell me why you wrote this paper. What were you responding to?
There's been a lot of interest in recent years in the long-termist community about thinking about better futures and sort of how can we design a far future for humanity that goes well and that kind of navigates humanity through giant transformations, including transformative AI and space colonization, and thinking about futures at much larger scales of both time and size. And our goal in this project is to sort of lay out a big systematic null hypothesis to answer questions about how to try to design the far future. And our basic, null hypothesis is that, in fact, maybe we already have many of the answers to how to plan for the far future already in our best institutions today. And so what we try to argue is that the kind of current liberal world order may be the best recipe for institutions for managing the far future. And we also try to lay out a methodology for answering these questions, because one of our concerns is that this literature, this growing literature about the far future and better futures, needs a stronger methodology. And so the methodology that we use in our paper is to lay out many of the canonical arguments for liberal institutions. Why are liberal institutions so effective at creating value? And then our methodology is to look at these canonical arguments and ask whether the arguments will still apply in the far future, whether they'll still apply under assumptions like extremely transformative AI, industrial explosions, vast space colonization. So that's kind of the overall point.
Yeah, and I would add two other things to that. One thing that we think there is happening in kind of the literature on better futures and long-termism and post-AGI world is sometimes the people who are writing in the genre are trying to think about like what the best world would look like. And obviously, I think some of the stuff you and Will have done is engage with this, and you've all even pushed back on the notion that we should be like envisioning a like final, universal utopia in the first instance. And I think we are trying to push like the reasoning back even one layer prior to like the Viatopia idea that you have with Will, which is like, maybe your idea is maybe we should manage something kind of along the way to a utopia. And one hypothesis we have is that it's very valuable to think not even about what particular states of the world, whether in the end state, the kind of the utopia, or the middle state of Viatopia, but rather the sort of institutions that move you forward at every margin, right? And so we're trying to think about the institutional arrangement that will produce the best long-term picture. And then, relatedly, we're trying to think about how these institutions will steer things over time. So one thing we think sometimes happens in both the long-termist literature, but also just literature on AGI and post-AGI worlds, is people who are worried will identify like a particular dynamic that may emerge like post-AGI. And it'll often be a real dynamic, like companies may get more powerful if they are producing AIs that run a lot of the economy, but then they kind of like run the trend indefinitely, like to the maximum, without thinking about whether there'll be countervailing and equilibrating forces that come from elsewhere in society. And this is one thing we think is particularly important about liberal institutions, but institutional stories more broadly, is institutions often mediate responses to trends, right? Like some things start to go up and then other things push against them, and they push those things in a different direction. So that's one reason we think the institutional story is so important, because institutions are quite often forces of equilibration.
Let me try saying some of that back. So I hear you as saying, at least in part, okay, there's this small literature from people thinking about the far future and how it can go well. And it's very focused on states of the world It's focused on certain kind of concrete details of, how do you get the most value. It is not sufficiently focused on procedure and institutions and, general equilibria rather than individual trends that you can kind of extrapolate as far as you want. And so that is a criticism of the methods, the framing, the approach. I wonder if you're also saying something more like, look, there are also specific proposals that people have made, and they seem bad.
Yeah, so there's a few things maybe it would be great to talk about today. So the first cluster of proposals I think will be constructive to discuss is, one topic. I mean, there's a lot of topics under the heading of Better Future. One topic is how should we pursue space colonization? And one concern that you and others have raised is that, we have to be, there's a great deal of early founder effect risk with space colonization, where if we just let things go naively, basically whoever gets to space first is going to capture the resources and control them all. And then to avoid that, what we need to do is is a much more egalitarian procedure of making sure everyone has an equal amount of, ownership of various space resources. And then there's different ways of implementing that. But at any rate, that's one target proposal. By contrast, we are thinking that space colonization can kind of be approached using the same tools that are used for, deep sea exploration today, and just standard things where you have an auction to dole out the property rights, and then that'll go well because it's going to kind of incorporate space into ordinary market mechanisms. So that's one place. Another thing I think will be great to talk about is there's been growing interest in the idea of handoffs to super intelligent AIs. So the idea being, well, in the future, super intelligent AIs will be so much better at ethics than we are, that really we should hand off control of major decisions to them. I think this is related to also an idea sometimes people call successionism, that maybe AIs rather than humans should at least have power in the future. And we worry, there's different ways of specifying this proposal, but at least some of those ways of specifying them strike us as illiberal. So on some versions of this, it sounds to us like saying, well, okay, so there's all of these humans vying for power today. They all have different conceptions of the good. And then somehow we need to arrange things so that, in fact, all their conceptions of the good are overpowered by just the super intelligent AI that we defer to. And by contrast, kind of the model of the future that we like is when maybe we kind of extend the franchise so that AIs with their own values are part of the decision-making process. But no, we don't want to just hand off everything to them. We might incorporate them into communal decision-making, but no, we want a liberal future where humans continue to be vying and competing with one another and with AIs to make decisions. And it's more like, there's a bunch of parties that all have different values, and then liberal institutions are the mechanism for taking all those different values and coming up with compromises. And there's some versions of handoffs that are compatible with that proposal, but at any rate, that gives some of the perspectives. And then maybe a third thing is, there's an idea of the so-called long reflection, that before we go about, space colonization and transformative economic growth, there should be a period where instead of having growth, we have sort of cultural, reflection to think about how to pursue these things. And we worry that what exactly does it mean to implement a long reflection? Because, even if we have 2 or 3% growth per year, that can, over 100 years, it quite quickly become quite explosive. And so we worry that in practice, trying to implement a long reflection might actually require dramatic departures from standard liberal institutions, since liberal institutions create growth. And again, there's ways of implementing a long reflection that won't be like that. So I think, some of how we feel is that some of the proposals that have been proposed so far are a bit vague and can be interpreted either as consistent with liberal institutions or not. So there's two different things. One is just which institutions are right, but then also more generally, we're proposing a methodology for thinking about these questions. And the methodology is we're going through all of the canonical arguments in the social sciences for why liberal institutions are good, and then assessing whether those arguments still apply. And so we're hoping that that methodology can help make progress on how to implement these various things. And we think that, in fact, it will tend to favor implementations that are much more continuous with our current institutions, rather than designing from scratch brand new policies.
And then in the limit, you could wonder whether some like once you work through these questions, like exactly what would it mean to pause and like have a long reflection. And if there's some versions of that we and maybe the people who prefer this stuff also just reject on reflection, because it would require, like freezing economic growth for 100 years in a way that would be an expectation bad. It could be that then the proposal actually like tends to converge like very closely to what we have now. So like one thing you might think is certain institutions like freedom of speech and like broad property rights are like allowing people to engage in a kind of reflection on what they value and what they want to do with their time and their resources. And those are sort of broadly liberal innovations. And so like one thing you could ask is like, at the limit, like the null hypothesis is like the long reflection is just like letting those institutions continue on as they go. Yeah. And then you say, okay, maybe that's not quite what we mean. Maybe we actually think like the world will be changing more quickly and we need to do something somewhat different. But then it allows you to define more sharply like which parts of the current arrangements you want to preserve, which ones you want to update, and how.
A lot of these arguments from the long-termist point of view, they are often framed in terms of, what is highest EV for humanity, as it were. How do you kind of capture most of the value? Maybe there's a lot of variance between the very best features and mediocre features. Should I be taking you as saying that, no, this is just not how we should be thinking about it, because the proposals which are plausibly highest EV would be illiberal, and that's a separate reason for not preferring them? Or are you saying something more like, look, it could turn out that these liberal proposals actually turn out to be highest EV too, and we're not appreciating that? Or is it something else? What's going on?
I think it's mostly the second thing. I think like one of our big claims, and this I think rhymes a fair deal with some stuff that you and Will have written about Viatopian thinking versus utopian thinking, which is you could define a like an end state of the world that's extremely high value, but then you have to ask like what is the path to get there that like most reliably gets you as close as possible. And I think a lot of the arguments for liberal institutions, a lot of the arguments for markets around how they allocate resources, how they incentivize innovation, a lot of the arguments for democracy around how they allow polities to correct errors and avoid like really big catastrophes, are all claims that these are institutions that like most reliably steer you toward higher value outcomes. Now, there's no guarantee that you get anywhere close to like the best physically possible world, like the best like world you could literally imagine or something like that. But like part of our claim is that these constraints are just as real as like physical constraints. Like if there's some world that you could physically create that would be like extremely, extremely good, but when you look at all the different ways societies could arrange themselves and get there, none of them get very close to that. And the one that gets closest, where it comes out of some set of liberal institutions, that's like a really good argument for doing the liberal thing, even if it doesn't get you to the best possible world in terms of like what physics allows.
I just wanted to sharpen the disagreement a bit. So we think a bunch of people at Forethought have been interested in this idea of Viatopia. And one way of regimenting Viatopia is the claim that when we're designing policies, we should be trying to optimize to get at least 50% of the total possible value that could be achieved. And one of our key claims is we do not think that that's a good methodology for finding the best policies. And the reason for that is that in our view, none of the standard arguments for markets and democracy have anything to do with either getting 50% of total value or getting 100% of total value. They're not optimizing their chance of getting a specific level of value. Rather, the standard arguments for markets and democracy are just arguing that markets and democracy have higher expected value than alternative institutions. And so we think the right question to be asking is, basically, which institutions have the highest expected value? And shooting for 50% of total value is actually not that's not a target that is helpful for finding the answers to these questions, because none of the standard evidence, none of the standard arguments for evaluating institutions is sensitive to the share of total value that you achieve.
And that's certainly true. If I were defending Viatopia, I would say, look, fine, that's a bit of a nit, doesn't really undermine the central concept, which doesn't have much to do with where you set the threshold, that's just for the sake of trying to be concrete about numbers. Really, the important thing is we care about how valuable the future is. And then the Viatopia concept is a way of kind of concretizing this idea of, a state that we could end up in that has kind of high EV in some predictable, robust way. So I don't know if, again, the threshold is the important thing, but we don't need to get into the weeds on that.
Well, I think that's a good thing to drill down in a bit, though. So the question would be, is there an alternative definition of Viatopia other than, so one thing is just what policies have the highest expected value?
Yeah, like one thing you could say is Viatopia is just what set of social institution produce the highest expected value in the long run. And then I think we would say, okay, well, that's a good question to be asking. And our claim is it's kind of the liberal one.
But the issue with that is I thought, because dialectically, I think Viatopia is supposed to be, well, instead of utopia is trying to achieve the very best outcome. And then Viatopia is some sort of satisficing thing where instead of trying to achieve the very best, you try to achieve some intermediate thing.
I would say that's not the centrally important aspect of what Viatopia is getting at. I would have said it's more to do with a utopia as a kind of attempt to describe an end state in any detail that is itself very valuable, and then Viatopia would be an attempt to describe an intermediate state that itself might not be, generating value, as it were. It could be, small in some sense, but just on track, and that would suggest, it does have more to do with institutions than what people are doing in the details.
Yeah, it's interesting. So as you understand the Viatopia idea, it's like it doesn't matter at all how much value there is in the Viatopian world.
Yeah, I mean, hence the word via, right? Like on the way. It's not like a semi-topia or something.
So there are two ways you could think about, you're on your way somewhere. I'm on my way to Yosemite. And there's like maybe two different ways I could think about getting there. And one would be like, there's a really important way station that I think I can navigate to easily, even if like the rest of the journey is hard. And I think that's kind of the Viatopian view, where it's like you're going to get to this way station. The way station will have like a bunch of features. And once you get there, like from there, maybe you'll see a lot more and know more about what the end state looks like, have different, better view about like how you should do your navigation from there or something like that. And then a different view would be like, well, no, you're just always operating at the margin. Like you just have a compass. Like the compass kind of points in the direction of Yosemite. And at every margin, you just like look where the compass is pointing and look which way you're pointing, and you kind of operate at each margin from there. And I think the liberal story is much more like the second thing. And my sense of Viatopia is it's much more like the first thing. Is that right?
Yeah, some of that does sound right to me. I don't want to speak on behalf of people who've been writing more about Viatopia recently, but
it's as you've written about it, like as you understand.
I think there is a perspective you can take where Viatopia looks really appealing as a concept, on which humanity is in this potentially brief but very high stakes, tumultuous period. Lots of things could go wrong, and AGI is a big part of that, right? And there's a thought that at some point, maybe soon, you can kind of breathe a collective sigh of relief because, in some sense, at least institutionally, society has kind of cooled down and kind of set into some structure that seems more robust or long-lasting. I think part of that's motivated by these arguments that we could, get various kinds of lock-in or stability after we get AGI, for better or worse. And that's a picture where I think, it's somewhat useful to think about, okay, what do we want society to look like at that point where we potentially transition from its chaos to it seems relatively more stable? I totally buy that there is another perspective you can take where I think there will be such a period or such a transition. History to date has been, just continual openness and contingency and uncertainty and, factions competing for different kinds of advantages. In theory, that can go on forever. Like the history can just remain open forever. That would be a view where Viatopia makes less sense. So I think that's kind of reasonable.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, well, I don't want to bog you too much down in Viatopia. But no, I think it's actually a nice example of the dialectic because, like it could be the case that, like what the Viatopia looks like is, you survive the AGI transition. I don't know, somehow, whatever. Like whatever you think is going to happen, like there's a very perilous period as, as AI capabilities rise very rapidly. But then you get to the other side where like the sort of acute existential threat is past. And then you say, oh, there's like a long future that we're gonna bravely go forth into. And like, what should we do? And then like one answer could be just do liberalism. Just like keep selling things in markets and keep, having elections, and like maybe you want the AIs to have a vote, and maybe you're gonna have to do some design stuff to like figure out like how to do that, how to allocate vote shares and aggregate preferences and those kinds of things. So it could actually end up that like the best Viatopia kind of converges to liberalism forever. And that could be fine. But we think like we think like one of the points of writing the paper is to like raise the possibility that this is how we should be thinking about things like Viatopia, like the long reflection, in terms of like what institutions we should have, as opposed to like what other kinds of substantive goods we might want to have in these states.
Yeah. The phrase that comes to mind is climbing the mountain from both sides, right? This idea that you're taking a different kind of conceptual toolkit. It could be that these two approaches converge. So I think the kind of, Team Viatopia would look at the liberal political toolkit and say, seems really promising, but it's just like totally doesn't have answers yet to all these questions we're going to have to face about how do you enfranchise AIs, how do you kind of count AIs in various ways, extending kind of rights that could be more or less appropriate to non-human entities. What about spreading to space, whether all these resources aren't yet claimed or propertized? So you're going to have to answer some questions which aren't yet, very obviously answered within the existing machinery. And then I think you could say to kind of Viatopian people, well, if you want to waste your time, you can kind of think about these questions from first principles. We kind of predict that you're going to, end up with probably quite similar ideas to these well-established ideas because they turn out to be good ideas. And so it could be a case of coming together. But, we'll see. Maybe we can have that conversation.
That's the claim. It's null hypothesis is our claim. Like liberalism as the null, it seems pretty good. There's some pretty good arguments, a lot of empirics. It seems pretty good. So, you should really have to wrangle with the null hypothesis.
Well, how about we just we jump into it? I kind of want to hear the positive case for liberalism, especially as applied to these post-AGI worlds. And I guess to be clear, you're talking about liberalism as in some combination of markets and democracy.
Yeah, I think it's basically right. And then, there are like supportive institutions, like, you can't really have markets without property rights. So rights clearly figure in to the story. I think some liberal, theorists would put individual rights as kind of a separate pillar. We kind of fold them in as sort of constituting markets and democracy. But yeah, those are the big pillars that we think are important.
Great. Well, okay, let me start you off. I mean, one case for economic markets, at least to date, is that they aggregate information, right? So independently of the incentives they set, the price mechanism is just a way to discover things about the world in a way that centralized bureaucracies can't do. Tell me a bit about that. And also, I'm kind of interested to know, does that really hold up once we have AGI that can just surely look at the world and figure out what everyone wants in a much more efficient way?
There are different kinds of information you might want to aggregate in a market. There's tacit information about how things are done or what the best way to do them is. There's information about what people want, their preferences, like whether they like chocolate versus vanilla ice cream better. Information about like the relative preferences of all the different things. Like maybe I like vanilla ice cream, but you like it even more than I do, and so you're willing to pay for more. And so like a standard, just classic Hayekian argument for markets is that it's really hard for central planners to aggregate all of this information in a way that allows them to allocate all the resources correctly, allocate all the stuff to people who use it the best. And that markets do this by allowing people to make and take prices, and that this is extremely useful. One thing you'd say is like, a really smart computer maybe could do better in aggregating information than we can do today, right? Like maybe it goes around and observes all the ice cream eaters and like can kind of to some degree infer their preferences, and can watch the laborers doing their tasks and can aggregate the tacit data in a sort of like centrally stored and retrievable way. Yeah, that's probably all true. It's also probably true of just like information technology more broadly, right? Like the computer age, I think, has allowed us to aggregate information much more efficiently, and it's actually enabled a lot more central planning than that was possible in the past. So like firms, which are centrally planned internally, most of them have gotten a lot bigger. Like it probably just wasn't possible to have an Amazon that existed as a centrally planned entity in, I don't know, 1910 or something like that. That argument we think is correct to a degree. There's a question about like the ratio between the ability to aggregate that kind of information and the amount of information that needs aggregated. So like Amazon is very big now, but Amazon probably couldn't run the global economy, in part because the global economy is a lot bigger than it used to be too. So there's like more kinds of information that need to be aggregated, in part enabled by the fact that firms themselves can aggregate more information. So I think you should probably expect that to be true with AI as well. Like the individual AIs will become better and better at aggregating and using information, but they'll create economic growth and new markets and complicated things that will then demand ever further aggregation. And so it's a little bit hard to know whether that converges to planning. But I would say beyond that, there are like other things that markets do aside from this sort of like information aggregation stuff that we think will be even more clearly important, even in a world with very capable AI.
Yeah, maybe I'll follow up with 2 points. One is markets don't merely aggregate information, they also elicit information. And so with eliciting information, the idea is like, well, actually the preferences of market participants, kind of the only way to access those preferences is to let them actually participate in the market and offer a price. Because if they don't offer the price, you can't figure out what preferences they have. And then there's an interesting question of like maybe future developments in neuroscience could actually allow preferences to be read directly off of minds without having those minds actually engage in a market transaction. So that's one question. The next thing I want to flag is that we think that standard arguments for markets suggest that there's an upper bound on the value of central planning anyway. So imagine a scenario where central planning, in fact, can resolve all informational issues. So all information can be elicited and aggregated efficiently, and now the central planner is going to go about figuring out how to allocate the goods. This is going to bring us to the second argument for markets, which is that, you know, the fundamental theorems of welfare economics suggest that, in fact, even if you have a central planner who can perfectly has all the information and is now going to allocate the goods, there's not a significant advantage in having the central planner do that compared to having markets do that. The main advantage would be maybe reducing transaction costs, but then we expect transaction costs to fall in the future anyways. So maybe that would bring us to the next argument, but maybe you also have questions about the information stuff before that.
Well, here's something that I was going to say on top of what Simon said about, so one possibility is, say, a preference elicitation, the idea that like how much you value ice cream or something, or like some flavor you've never tried before. It's not just that it's not aggregated, it's like latent in the books of your brain or something like that. And so actually the way you produce the information is you present the price to the agent and you see if they're willing to pay. And that actually is like generative of the information. There's then the question, okay, could you just like have advances in neuroscience that read the thing off the brain? And like one possibility is what that looks like is you have a like extremely high fidelity simulation of a bunch of minds, and then you're presenting them with a bunch of extremely high fidelity like price offers, right? It's like, here's some digital ice cream at some digital price that you can. And so it's like funny the way in which it's like this, it seems to almost converge to markets, but in simulation rather than in real life. And then I guess you could ask, okay, maybe there's two economies: there's the digital economy and like there's a shadow digital economy and there's the real economy, but they just operate in parallel, but you're still sort of running the market process. Like it's an interesting question whether that's a market economy or whether it's a centrally planned economy.
I mean, one difference might be in a planned economy, some ice cream arrives at your door and, $5 are taken out of your bank account and you get a message from the planner that says, yeah, we ran the simulations on your simulated digital self. Turns out you just love this ice cream. You're going to love it. Maybe people kind of come to like this setup. I can imagine some people thinking, no, that is kind of importantly different from me really choosing to buy the ice cream. I'm not like totally okay with this. And I guess we'll talk about this later, but the version of this in kind of the political setting, so when it comes to voting, maybe is like especially problematic, where in theory you can scan everyone's brains, kind of give everyone what they want without going through the process of actually doing any kind of democratic deliberation or input. There's something that seems kind of spurious about that, or something's missing there.
Yeah. Although I guess I would like emphasize that when you're doing this planning version, at least as I've described it, what you're doing is running an extremely high fidelity simulation of the person you're selling something to. And that includes not just running them in simulation. You have to run like, I don't know, to first approximation, the whole economy, right? Because there's all kinds of stuff happening, right? Like the relative value of ice cream depends on a lot of things, like what that simulated agent is earning, right? Like there's like wealth effects on your preferences, for example. And maybe the same for democratic deliberation too. So like I agree there's something maybe spurious or puzzling there, but it starts to look less like a divergence from what we do now if what you're imagining is actually like the whole universe, the whole world at some sufficient level of fidelity is being simulated in such a way that allows you to get not just like like some raw-ish like dispositional information about how much people enjoy ice cream, but all the information you need to know, like actually how much they're willing to pay, which depends on a whole bunch of people in the world. And so it's like, then you've got two economies, one of which is sort of lashed to the other. And that's still a little weird, but it's not exactly like the case where you're like skipping all the steps in the middle.
One case for markets, they aggregate information and they elicit information efficiently. It sounds like what you're saying is that's true, and there's a certain kind of conversion. So in cases where planning is more effective because of transaction costs or whatever, well, firstly, transaction costs go down. Secondly, you're allowed to just have a firm and plan within the firm. And then on the other hand, if we started with a top-down planner, it may just turn out that the way that they plan most effectively is basically to emulate a market system. And so there's a kind of convergence. I'm going to go ahead and say that it feels to me like the kind of efficiency arguments for markets are not the crux somehow. It feels like not a ton hinges on this. Does that seem right to you?
I mean, there's a sense in which we have a social planner in like, liberal Western countries. And what the thing the social planner has done is make like the British government, the American government would just decide not to recognize individual rights to, like choose your job and your consumption or whatever. And so, it's a sense in which like the planner has chosen the market allocation. But we think it's really important that, these economists have done that as opposed to doing something different, right? Trying to allocate goods without reference to like price signals. And so we think that's really important. If it turns out that all the post-AGI stuff sort of converges to that, in the end, we think that's like a pretty strong argument that markets are the thing in the relevant sense in the long run.
Yeah, sorry, I think I agree with that. And I realized what I was saying is it just seems like the case for markets is fairly clear here. I think if I were trying to make the strongest possible case against markets and for planning post-AGI, it probably wouldn't be in terms of aggregating information and allocating goods in some efficient way.
Got it.
I mean, just because markets are already quite efficient.
Yeah, I do think the efficient allocation of goods is definitely worth, I think, more attention from long-termists, because here's kind of how I think about it. So we have these fundamental theorems of welfare economics, and they tell us that when there is not market failures, markets will achieve a Pareto-efficient allocation, and then you can get a different Pareto-efficient allocation using tax and transfer. And then the reason I think those theorems are useful is that then I think, so the natural way based on those theorems to then think about public policy is that the two main jobs of public policy is to address market failures and then do tax and transfer. And so then I think it's extremely orienting on the methodology for thinking about the far future, where really, if you want to be proposing something weird institutionally, besides just having markets, you got to find a market failure. And then the other thing to look at is to think about what the best tax and transfer scheme will be in the far future. And there again, it'll be the usual question of kind of diminishing marginal utility for resources, things like that. But I think that the key thing about allocative efficiency is that it orients questions of optimal institutions around market failure. So then the question is whether, or one of the crucial questions for thinking about institutions is to go through each market failure and think about whether in the far future that market failure is likely to be more or less of an issue. And then I think some of your work with Will has claimed that there's going to be market failures related to concentration or monopoly involved in space colonization. And then another big dynamic is that transaction cost is one of the main, failures, and that will fall in the future. And then related to transaction costs falling, the most important market failure is probably externalities. But then as transaction costs fall, it becomes possible to just address externalities through Coasean bargaining. And so I think those are like the key dynamics for making sense of optimal institutions. And that all comes out of the questions of allocative efficiency. Does that make sense?
So you're saying if there is a case for some kind of planning or some alternative to free markets post-AGI, then they are probably going to have to root through, arguments that markets don't address certain kinds of really big market failures in the way that they occasionally don't today. That's, at least today, the best way to kind of make that case. And the cases where, in fact, a government should be stepping in, for example.
Which, by the way, we agree with. We agree there are many cases in the present, and they could continue to persist in the future. Yeah.
Yeah. I take it that the thing that you're championing is this kind of, mixed liberal democratic model where you obviously have like welfare spending and you have taxation and certain amounts of
and you have tort law and like regulations of certain kinds of externality. Yeah, yes, good, all good, all good. We don't want to be like, we think that starting with the allocative efficiency argument is good, but that doesn't mean we think that markets automatically take care of everything.
But also each market failure has canonical solutions within liberalism, and then we want to stay very close to those solutions. So very specific kinds of antitrust regulations that are sensitive to price and quality rather than random other things. And then for externalities, things like Pigouvian taxation.
Okay, let's talk about one of the market failures you mentioned, which is concentration. So, here's an argument. We'll get AGI, and then maybe very quickly it'll be possible for some actor that is, well positioned to do this to go and grab all the resources in space. Maybe they'll build the Dyson sphere, or they'll go and race to the other stars. At that point, if they can defend those resources, or if there's a property regime that allows them to, in some recognized way, own them, suddenly they kind of, in a material sense, kind of own the vast majority of owned wealth. That seems bad, partly from a kind of allocative efficiency perspective. People have diminishing returns to wealth. It would be kind of better if wealth were more evenly distributed for that reason. Seems bad from a kind of power concentration perspective, where it becomes a political matter rather than just an economic one.
But to be clear, the big problem with market concentration from the allocative efficiency perspective is just that you'll get inefficient outcomes where, because they're a monopolist, they'll charge higher prices and have lower quality. And I want to decompose. So I think you've actually raised three different possible market failures. One is maybe whoever gets AGI first will have a monopoly in AI. Two, maybe whoever gets space resources first will be a monopolist on the use of the space resources. And three, maybe whoever develops Dyson spheres or Dyson swarms will have a monopoly on energy. And I think it's worth looking at all three of those separately. Why don't we have Peter start with space resources? I'll then do Dyson swarms, and then maybe Peter can do AI.
Yeah, when you think about the capture and control of space resources. So yeah, one naive model is you leave Earth, you get to some asteroids, you kind of use some of the resources on the asteroids to make more asteroid capture stuff, and then you expand, and there's kind of exponential expansion there, and then at some point you planted a flag on or have defended or whatever. You have all the stuff. And then a worry is that you might have all the stuff forever in a way that means no one else has any stuff. That's a distributional question. And then there's also the question of like, well, you'll be a monopolist on this stuff in a way that you charge too much for the use of it, you reduce welfare and output in that way. And so like one intuition pump is, there have been like a lot of resource races in history. Like Standard Oil, for example, is a company that like gobbled up a lot of the energy production in, I guess, the late 19th and early 20th centuries. There have been land capture races when, European countries are going around and colonizing the world. And so there are a lot of historical examples of this sort of thing. And I think one thing we can notice across all of those examples is it's in general not the case that the people who get all the stuff first end up with it in the end, nor do they maintain. It's not even that the case that like they maintain their big wealth advantage in the long run. So like, like Rockefeller and Carnegie were by far the richest people in society at the time when they were at the peak of their wealth. They had a lot of steel, they had a lot of oil, but they didn't, number one, keep all the steel and oil, and number two, didn't keep all the wealth. And the reason they didn't keep all the steel and oil was there were other people who wanted to use it, and so they sold it to people who could use it for other kinds of things, and engaged in positive sum bargains to do that. And not only that, but a lot of the people who wanted to use the oil and the steel for other things came up with ways to use them that were like even more valuable than the oil and the steel. So like one thing we can do now is we can turn oil into energy and energy into tokens and tokens into intelligence. And that seems going to be extremely valuable for the economy. And that means that whoever invents, like capable AIs, frontier AI labs, are like now capturing a whole bunch of the surplus from energy production in a way where like in the past you might have worried that the oil companies would just get all of the surplus from the energy production because they have a lot of the energy. You shouldn't assume that this won't happen in the future. So, there's not somebody who goes to space, they get really specialized in capturing space resources. They have a lot of space resources. They're sort of sitting on them. And it's like, what are they going to do with the space resources? I mean, maybe even like if you're thinking in a long-termist sense, maybe they have like a strong ideology. They have like an idea about what the best composition of atoms is, right? You got to put atoms into some sort of composition that gives you hedonium or something like that. And so it's not even that they expect somebody else to invent a better use of the space resources. It doesn't, even in that case, rule out the possibility that someone else will like invent a better process for converting matter to hedonium, or a better process for linking up all the hedonium to one another. If it's like, a network good, you put it all together and experiences more pleasure. So maybe, as long as there's the possibility of specialization and of innovation, it's actually extremely hard to predict who will end up with all the stuff, and also who will end up with all the resources, with all of the wealth that the stuff produces. So like, could you get a single entity that owns everything and has all the technology, and there's no more innovation, and thus there's no more possibility for trade? It's like probably possible in principle, but we think it's like way less obvious than the base case might make it seem.
Yeah, I can throw in some reflections there. I mean, that all just does make total sense. I might worry that if we do get a period of very rapid R&D progress or innovation, then there will be fewer opportunities for catch up, let's say, from incumbent innovators who kind of move faster than entrenched wealth holders, which has been a mechanism that's kind of displaced kind of quasi monopolies in the past. And then another force has just been some kind of randomness, right? Some big company misses out on the big trend, it's IBM or whatever, and then it just falls behind, or it's Kodak and it misses digital photography. Maybe there are some arguments, and this is a little extreme as a view, but it's not crazy sounding to me. Everyone just figures out all the technology, within some period of time. And also everyone just has very good kind of strategic advice from the AIs. So it's much harder to make these, rookie strategic errors that kind of cause a lot of the, turnover and equalizing of kind of wealth between players. So those would be some reflections, but I think it's not fully answering what you said.
I'll follow up a bit here. I'm going off script a bit, so higher error rates. But, I think one thing to think about there, insofar as the worry is new innovations, basically, it's not really a monopoly in the control of the resources. Now it's a monopoly in ideas, basically, in innovations that people can't catch up. And so to me, at first pass, that would be solved by getting the right intellectual property right regime in place. So it's like, look, probably in that scenario, you don't want intellectual property rights that allow someone to just unilaterally hold an idea for 1,000,000 years. Because if you do that, then for the 1,000,000 years, if no one else can come up with the idea in that time, then yeah, basically, the function of intellectual property rights is effectively to grant short-term monopolies. And we do that to incentivize the production of new ideas. But precisely because it grants a monopoly, there's always a finicky trade-off in doing that, because you're getting more innovation, but then you're creating a little bit of market failure. And so then, if that's the problem, that's a interesting problem, but I think it's solvable again using standard liberal tools by just shortening the, time at which intellectual property rights are enforceable. So kind of the faster, so I would think that would be the kind of toolkit to be looking at. Now then the question would be, well, even if they don't have an intellectual property right, if they can nonetheless somehow just keep their idea and they don't give it to anyone else, then what happens? But then we get into interesting dynamics again, because if they're not going to use the idea as efficiently as someone else, then someone else will buy the idea from them. And I guess that's true under property rights too. So anyways, I guess I'm curious, Peter and Finn both, what do you think of that?
Yeah, that all sounds right to me. Like, you can imagine, I think you can maybe just define a state of affairs where there's there's some singleton super intelligence that not only is like the smartest thing in the world, but is like has managed to buy up literally all of the resources in the world that you could use to produce things like ideas, and is able to keep enough of a monopoly on every marginal new idea such that it reliably puts it to its absolute best use in producing future new ideas. It does it with just like extremely high reliability before the idea diffuses, and its bets always pay off just like much better than anybody else's, right? Maybe, but the stuff you described as like would be mistake. I'm not really sure I agree with that characterization. I think that it's true that one thing that displaces incumbents is there are a whole bunch of people making a whole bunch of bets, and then as time progresses, there's like some reversion to the mean on the sort of bets like the incumbents make, and then some other people make good bets. And that's partially because making bets is hard, but also partially because different bet makers are specializing in different ways, right? Like they're sort of dividing the labor of figuring out what kinds of bets are best. I think in many, many futures, even with very powerful AI systems, where there's some differentiation between them, right? And even if there's one that's like strictly better at almost everything than all the others, but nonetheless faces trade-offs at the margin for like how to use its labor and like thinking about what bets it should take. Like it literally can't take all the bets. Like you should expect some of these dynamics to persist. If you're worried about this problem, I don't think what we want to say is it's impossible that it could arise, but I think you should really be trying to engage with all these mechanisms along the way that dissipate large holdings wealth sort of naturally via market mechanisms, that maybe dissipate them via policy by monkeying with the property regime. Should like tick off the whole list and say, okay, under what conditions did none of these work? And I think our claim is it's not so many conditions.
Yeah, maybe to make this more concrete, what do you make of this idea that one country could outgrow the world, shortly after some kind of intelligence explosion? The idea is that once you have a bunch of robotics and you have AGI, you can just indigenously manufacture everything. You're more prepared to kind of take the deal where you are not trading in order to gain a relative advantage, because you can just leverage that, strategically. And that's just totally possible because, again, you can do everything domestically now.
I think that idea would have the relevant country behaving illiberally, because that country would be making it illegal for the companies in that country to sell their ideas and services to companies in other countries. Because if that didn't happen, I think the same dynamics we're talking about would apply, which is all this great new tech and this new robotics. Well, actually, the best, if SpaceX has all this stuff, they can sell it to the Vietnamese, and that'll be really valuable for them, and they'll make a lot of money doing that. But then what would happen is the U.S. government would come in and block that sale. But then blocking that would be a departure from standard liberal institutions by blocking free trade. So I do think that's a risk, and then I have a recommendation, which is to have free trade.
This is not an unheard of policy today, right? There are like many countries that either have strong industrial policies, some that try to implement autarky. Is that the right way of talking about only domestic production?
Yeah.
And it's like you could do it in principle, and like you could even do it in principle if you were the fastest growing country in the world, right? But you'd still be giving up all the gains from trade, right? Like it means that the SpaceX robotics, there's some marginal unit of robot that's like going to get sent to like domestic rice paddies in Louisiana to grow what rice, when in fact like the Indian and Vietnamese markets are extremely good at producing rice, and that's probably not the greatest use of like a highly capable industrial robot piloted by a superintelligence.
Yeah, I think one response might be that there are fewer of today's gains from trade in a world where you can automate labor and also you can just generate ideas cheaply, right? So you have less of this kind of, specialization between countries. And then another thought is, in this outgrowing the world scenario, even if it is plausible, I agree that it would be in some sense illiberal because it would presumably require export controls or the state itself just outbidding any foreign buyer. And so presumably it would be kind of politically motivated. And so maybe part of what you're proposing is that the best futures don't involve these kind of politically motivated power struggles. And maybe there are kind of ways to mitigate that internationally. It seems tricky, but it does seem potentially right.
So yeah, to be clear, our thesis is not that everything's going to be great. Our thesis is that liberal institutions have the highest expected value. And then sadly, I think there is a significant chance of the scenario you said happening. And I think part of what's happening is the anarchy of international relations, where in fact, the way states relate to one another, they're not democratically governed, they're anarchistically governed, they're not governed. And so then they do not have liberal institutions governing their relations. And so, yeah, that's a big bummer.
Yeah. So one more question on monopolies and concentration of wealth. So as you said, the standard reason to prevent monopolies in the kind of liberal economic framework is just it's a market failure. They kind of dead weight loss from charging higher prices, right? That seems like a really kind of weird or like quite down the list on the things that I would worry about when I'm imagining these scenarios where, one company builds AGI first and has this huge amount of kind of wealth and power, or one company seizes all the resources in space. Is there something there that these economic frameworks are just kind of missing the thing that's clearly more important here, which is more, morally flavored or politically flavored?
Well, I think it's really worth distinguishing the morally flavored one from the politically flavored one. So one morally flavored thing is that maybe inequality is just bad per se. If we're talking about wealth inequality or consumption inequality, the way to address that is just through tax and transfer. And again, that's already done, one way to deal with, there's different conceptions of what's wrong with inequality. One is just the diminishing marginal utility per dollar. And so then that can all be addressed on the tax and transfer side. I think the different issue you're saying is, well, maybe there's something kind of politically unstable about having extremely powerful companies that rival the power of states. And there, I think that would more go on I think that's a totally fair point. But that probably would be more addressed on the set of democracy arguments. But yeah, so I agree. That's an important factor that is not directly modeled just through looking at the arguments for allocative efficiency.
Yeah, a lot of the democracy arguments have a sort of implicit model where there's a state and the state has to make choices about what like goods to provide or what policies to provide to the people. And one of the main things that disciplines the state is the possibility of revolution. And so you can imagine worlds where either power is extremely concentrated in the state, right? A world where like the government has sole control of like the only super intelligence, right? And maybe this gives it like total immunity from the threat of revolution, or the same if it turns out to be some private company. And that can undermine those arguments for democracy working well. I mean, they also tend to, I think, undermine arguments that other systems are going to work well. It's not like this makes authoritarianism more attractive relatively. It's probably the opposite. But there's serious concerns you should be worried about.
Yeah, and we'll talk about democracy shortly. One point on what you said, Simon, is to the extent that we should be thinking about diminishing returns to wealth, and that we should be, from a kind of social planning perspective, caring about something other than just reaching Pareto best outcome or just maximizing dollar wealth. So I think that's kind of true. It's just clearly the case that I prefer to give $100 of consumption to someone who's really struggling financially than someone who's fabulously wealthy, just from the consumption point of view. But the reasons I would give for that don't come from economics, right? They're like fundamental theorems of welfare economics. Can tell you about Pareto improvements as far as I understand them, but they don't tell you about when is a dollar of consumption actually best in an all things considered sense.
So we're fine with that. And that's all consistent with the arguments for liberalism, because again, the point is supposed to be, within liberalism, you have markets and then you do tax and transfer. And then you do tax and transfer to achieve different, solutions to issues related to inequality. So my view is, there's not, the questions about inequality aren't very interesting because we know the best solution to them, which is some form of tax and transfer. And then there's interesting questions about what the most efficient or deadweight loss minimizing tax is. And then that's it. So that, that's basically, it's just very straightforward, I think.
Well, I mostly agree with what Simon said. I mean, the one thing, like the one wrinkle I would add is, like the fundamental theories of welfare economics don't tell you about utility. They just tell you about Pareto efficiency, given however much money everybody has. And that's why we do tax and transfer, because we do think, we as scholars, but we as a society do think it is just like very good to give the poorest people more consumption. It's much more important than giving rich people more consumption. We don't want to give all, it would be a big mistake for, like tax rates on people earning over $100,000 a year in the United States, like to be like 100% at the margin. That would be bad, not just because it would reduce the consumption of people earning over $100,000 a year, but it would be bad in the long run to the people earning much less. Theory predicts, and empirics seem to support, because then it would much reduce the output of the people earning the highest wages, much reduce growth, and much reduce then the pie from which you can take slices from the high earners and give them to the low earners. So those are interesting kinds of questions to be thinking about. Like, what is the right rate of tax and transfer that's best for social welfare, given that you think AI might grow the economy very quickly, therefore giving you a lot more resources to then potentially transfer to the right people to improve.
And one way this comes up, so in recent discourse, now there's all these, people running around advocating crazy taxes related to AI. Like, we'll have a compute tax, or, we'll just we'll have an AI lab tax. We'll do this tax, we'll do this tax. And then I think our view is that a lot of this is extremely silly, because we just have a lot of existing tax tools that you could just use those tools. So for example, it would be probably much more effective to just, you want to maybe slightly raise the corporate tax rate in general, because obviously if you just tax the AI labs, then money will trickle in other directions. And just taxing compute, a terrible idea, because, obviously then the labs will just work out substitutes to compute and find efficiencies in other ways. So the point is, we have a lot of standard tools to deal with inequality, and we can just use those tools. We don't have to suddenly invent radical new mechanisms, because the tools just directly apply,
Right. And so I hear you saying, okay, there's this question of what kinds of consumption to whom, and how does it depend on your existing wealth? matter most, those are important questions and not questions that just fall out of, basic kind of welfare economics. They're moral questions, right? You have to kind of think about them, or maybe they need to be decided democratically. So sure, they are real questions, but then separately from that, if you're wondering, okay, how do we most efficiently, generate wealth and then distribute it to the best ends, the best forms of consumption? Well, we have answers to those questions because those are economic questions. And the answer is, markets plus taxation and spending, and particular kinds of taxation are more efficient than others.
Yeah, the moral question is, there's going to be a trade-off between how much inequality you remove and then how much lower total growth you have or total resources you have as a result of that. And then the moral question is how to navigate the trade-off between total wealth and then the equality. And that's a moral question. And then that will just inform where you go. And then you find the tax mechanism that's, has the least loss. And then you kind of, you just pick where you want to be on that frontier. But that's all well understood. So we just don't see any special problems in the far future related to that. We just think it'll be the same boring, question that's hard to answer, but forever.
If anything, the innovations in tax policy should be like less weird. The taxes we have, for example, in the United States, I think most economists think are not like the optimal taxes. Like we should be taxing externalities a lot more and income somewhat less, for example.
Yeah, so we expect exactly. So the deadweight loss from taxes should fall over time, but there's going to be a limit to how much it falls. And then once technology gives us the ultimate optimal tax, then there will still be a trade-off between growth and distribution.
Well, let me ask you about growth, actually, since you raised it. So, okay, to date, you're a medium-sized liberal democracy. You're growing 2 or 3% a year. You face these questions of, do you sacrifice, 0.5% of growth to redistribute more, have a stronger welfare state? These are kind of quite familiar questions. You're saying, look, by default, they'll extend into the future. We should apply the same approaches to answering these questions as we always have. And then part of me wants to say, once we, again, kind of plausibly get something like AGI, we then get very rapidly sped up growth. I even think maybe it's more likely than not that growth rates in the succeeding years or decades are in some sense, wildly or uncomfortably or chaotically high. It feels like these kind of questions of, it's a balancing act. They feel somehow inappropriate. It's just like, we're going to get all the growth we could possibly get, at least on cosmic timescales, basically instantly. And then it feels like, how do we maximize growth? It matters to the extent that it matters for people alive today, and it matters in the short term. But perhaps in this very kind of long-term sense, doesn't feel like the right question. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it requires some calculation, I think. So the thought will be, you're looking at two different tax policies, and it's like one will get you, 50% per year tax growth, and the other will get you 49%. And then the claim is, well, in the long run, and then it sounds like one claim you were making is in the long run, those will have very similar total amounts of wealth. But then second of all, you could imagine that the two policies have a large difference in distribution. So that would be the setup. Yeah, interesting. I mean, I have to think about whether that's true, because you could also imagine, well, then there will also be a correspondingly small effect on distribution. And then there could be other factors too. I mean, to me, when I'm thinking about these chaotic scenarios, I tend to be more worried about, does one policy change risk of ruin, risk of extinction more, rather than, because I guess I would be surprised if one of the two tax policies had very strong long run effects on distribution. Because for the reasons Peter and I were saying about space research, we think of distribution as something that tends to not be persistent, but changes a lot over time. But I think that's a very interesting question.
It's like an interesting question. What counts as like a lot of growth versus versus a little? Like if we're 40 or 50% growth, everything, the Earth gets very big very quickly. But then also like the universe is very big, and long-termists tend to be quite interested in the universe. And like a universal scale, like I think the intuitions are very hard to pump. But like, the universe is expanding and like speed of light is fixed. And so it could be that like, the difference between, like some high, like double digit growth and like 3 percentage points less than that, once you like extrapolate the model, accounting for like physical limits of the universe, gets you a big difference that you should care about. If not, I guess like that would be in some sense good news, because we would, the main thing is to be getting the growth, and we should worry a little bit less about the marginal tax rate. We should just like make sure the markets are working reasonably well, and like, that's casual liberalism forever, because it's like going to be kind of fine. But you still could really mess it up by doing something weird that like prevents you from escaping the solar system or something like that.
Everything you've said does make sense. I would agree that if growth is indefinitely exponential at any rate of growth, then it really does matter that you are sacrificing some growth rate through redistribution. It could still be worth doing, to be clear, but these are gaps that compound over time by the nature of growth. And so maybe you just have to look to the physics, more or less, right, to have some picture of how long can true exponential growth continue. I think there are a large factor of growth historically has been driven by technology or ideas. At some point, you can imagine that we cap out there. We also, in some sense, fill up Earth just physically, mechanically. At some point, then you get bounded by travel to other stars. So then growth would be, at best, cubic, if you think that it tracks just how much physical stuff do you have access to. In any case, there are these arguments that any meaningful rate of exponential growth cannot go on for more than a century or so before, every atom in the accessible universe has an Earth's worth of wealth in some sense. Growth stops even making conceptual sense then. So it seems plausible that actually, no, exponential growth just cannot continue, and therefore should not be the kind of the framing that you're using when thinking about the very long term or somewhat long term.
Even in that case, though, like the difference between setting out to capture all resources in the accessible universe, like this year versus a few years from now, gives you a different sized accessible universe. So there's some margin there, I think. And then the other question, like it, and this is very hard to reason about, but like, I don't know. I think it's true that technology runs out eventually. Like you could imagine a different perspective where like technologies are kind of combinations of prior ideas, and there's no in principle limit to how many ways you can combine prior ideas in better and more welfare producing ways. It's a little bit hard to know this. One view of science is like there's some physical laws and we're trying to discover them, and then like once we discover them all, we'll kind of have all of the technology, and then that'll be it. Like a different model would be the model of like computer science or math, where you actually don't really get going in having science until you discover the fundamental rules. And then there's like not really an in principle ceiling on the ways in which you can combine them and use them. So in a world like that, it's like, I don't know, can you just keep growing? Could you grow infinitely on Earth? Maybe, I don't know. It's like confusing.
Yeah, I agree. It's confusing. I guess I'll add one thought, and I'm aware this is a total rabbit hole, so we can move on shortly. But Toby Ord has thought about these questions, so I think this probably comes from a conversation with him at some point. But in these conversations, it may turn out that an important question is what happens to the end of civilization or history. And so if you think that what you're doing when you increase growth rates is essentially bringing forward history, you're kind of compressing it in time, and thereby bringing forward the end date, then the kind of integral of all the wealth or everything you care about presumably does not increase and maybe decreases depending on how you think about it. If you think that the endpoint is in some sense exogenous, so maybe it's fixed by the timeline of the universe or whatever, then when you increase growth rates, you kind of get more of the end, right? You bring everything else forwards. And what matters is just how much of the last slice you kind of now have bought for yourself by kind of getting there a bit earlier. A bit like, if you race on a drive to a family holiday, you just have more time on holiday at the end of it. So maybe these kind of very far future questions actually turn out to be somewhat relevant.
Yeah. But it's to be clear, the view is that it would be if the holiday is nice, it's good actually to get there faster. Yeah.
And it's not quite as good as you might think if you thought that growth was exponential forever,
Sure.
but it's still very good.
Yeah.
Maybe can I get two other dangling threads on the table before we move
Great,
on?
yeah.
First is we've been talking about how growth distribution may look different from thinking about growth in the far future, but there's also interesting questions about how to normatively assess distribution in the far future. I find today when people worry about inequality, people care a lot about the difference in wealth between a 10 millionaire and somebody who only has $50,000. People don't seem to care much about the inequality between like Elon Musk and somebody who has $10 million. So, if you take that seriously, one picture is no. In the far future, if average wealth levels are in general much higher, then actually inequality is no longer normatively significant. What really matters to inequality is something more prioritarian of what's the floor, how are the worst off doing, something like that. But then there, I think one crux will be, even if there's a lot more welfare in the future, how is it bundled among people? You could imagine, that there's vast numbers of people with roughly our current level of welfare, and that's how you get, and then inequality might matter more. Or you could imagine slightly less vast with, numbers of people with higher welfare levels. So obviously, I just wanted to flag that. And then I have another thing.
Why not? Throw it out there.
Okay. So you had brought up Dyson swarms as another possible case of market concentration. And indeed, in the halls of the long-termists, I often hear worries about Dyson swarms and market concentrations. And I just want to flag for any long-termists listening out there that I'm very confused about what the worry is supposed to be, because as I understand it, a Dyson swarm is there's a lot of different stuff in there, and you got all these different solar panels floating around, and nobody says that there's any economic rationale for why would one person own the whole swarm? You can call it a Dyson swarm, but why isn't what we're talking about just, all right, there's a lot of solar panels and different people own the different solar panels, and at some point it gets really cheap. There's just solar panels are really cheap, and the cost of energy is low, and as usual, energy will be supplied at the market price, and once it's really cheap, if there's a lot of demand for it, there will be a lot of energy out there, but there's no market concentration of any kind. There may be billions of people owning chunks of the Dyson swarm, and there's no interesting policy question about it because it's just a market in energy. So I've been quite befuddled about the question about what are we supposed to do about Dyson swarms? I think nothing.
If anything, the case for worrying about market concentration in energy on Earth is maybe stronger. And that's because on Earth, energy travels over wires, and wires have network characteristics. So you can expend resources and make a network, and it increases superlinearly in its value. And like plausibly, you can monopoly effects. This is why energy grids tend to be like NPU, they're managed as sort of natural monopolies in most cases, although there are exceptions, including Texas where I live, which is much more market oriented. But I don't think Dyson swarms are going to be transferring their energy to users with wires. I expect it'll be like lasers or something, right? I mean, I'm not an expert in this, but that's my sense. And now you're going to have a bunch of solar panels wired up together, and then a big thick copper coil going to the space settlement. It's no, it'll be beamed directly. And so there, it's not even, there's not natural monopoly worries as far as I can tell. You're just adding marginal units of power. It's like if everyone was just powering their house off the solar on their roof, where's the natural monopoly? Especially if you could just stack as many solar panels as you wanted up there.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm happy to say some things on this. I don't know if my own view is very clear yet, but first of all, my understanding is that it would be quite hard to, send power. And so I expect that most of the uses of the power will be in situ, in the place of collecting it. Which does raise this question of what on earth are these solar panels being used for? I think one answer is, something to do with compute, because you can send information back. Or you might just care about what the computer's doing intrinsically in some way. And another answer might be some kind of hard power or weaponization. But just putting that aside, what might the worries be? I think one thing to say is that you can tell a story where you could get this kind of natural monopoly forming potentially quite easily. So one reason would be, seems like there are less forces towards specialization that normally kind of enforce a certain kind of distribution of wealth. It just seems like the way you build, something like a Dyson sphere or anything that is kind of autonomously manufactured in a kind of self-growing way is you just start off the process, and then if you're ahead of everyone else, you remain ahead of everyone else. You don't really need to be importing stuff because no one else has enough resources unless they started about the time that you started. And once you've started, it could, kind of build itself in some sense very quickly. Okay, so that's how you might get, at least initially, a kind of monopoly. But then why would it be worrying, where I guess what you would say is, well, they would just trade away, what use could one company or person possibly have for the end product of this project?
And they can't charge monopoly prices because you just described a totally free entry system. It's like, okay, you put your Dyson seed on some asteroid and it started gobbling up, and now you've satisfied your energy needs, or maybe you're still growing, and you say, oh, I have all the space compute, all the Dyson sphere compute, and I want to exclude everyone else from it, or I want to charge really high prices for it. I say, okay, fine, I'll just put my Dyson seed for an asteroid, right? It's like additive, right? What's the moat? What's the exclusionary power?
And more, I contest even Dyson Swarm as making that much sense, because I think more what the future will look like is it's just cheap to make energy, and then people get as much energy as they want. But then there's not going to be some lunatic out there who's just like getting more and more energy than they could possibly use, just because, that doesn't make economic sense. So the amount of energy created will just be from the market price, Yeah.
And to be clear, I don't know if what I'm saying is actually making sense. I'm kind of thinking out loud here, but consider this possibility, right? So let's say some private space company decides to set out and build the Dyson Swarm. And the way they're going to do this is they're going to send up some initial, payloads to near-Earth asteroids or whatever it is. And that'll begin a process where they're, mining the asteroids, building solar panels, using the energy they're collecting to send off more, probes to the next asteroid, and they're kind of repeating that, right? So it's, effectively kind of exponential growth process. Now, let's say that they get to do this some number of months ahead of the second mover. If you're a late entrant now, it is just quite difficult, presumably, to catch up by the nature of exponential growth, unless you find out some way to kind of have an edge on the growth rates. And I just don't know whether that's likely or not. I just don't have very, very good models either way.
Why does it matter if you can catch up? Like, in the sense of like having as many Dyson, what do we say? Dyson probes? Dyson whatever Dyson powery things. If the monopolist, if the first mover is serving the whole market already and charging monopoly prices, well, then if you can enter and undercut their price, then
I see what you're saying.
Yeah. If they're not serving the full market, then it's just additive. You can just start your own Dyson Swarm program, and then you're serving the market, and you'll have 20%, and they'll have 80%. But that's like, there are many markets like that. That's basically fine.
But also, the initial assumption you had, I felt, should be endogenous to the model, because you said, suppose a company decides to build a Dyson Swarm. But I don't understand that, because it's like, are they selling it effectively? Like, who's buying it? It doesn't make any sense. Like, and then you're saying like, well, because they build a thing and it goes out, you have the von Neumann probes and they go out and mine the resources. But then the key economic question would be, well, the resources they're mining, could those resources have been used for something other than a Dyson Swarm on the margin? And why are we going full swarm? Why don't they just build as much for energy as they can sell energy and then build other stuff for the other stuff? So I feel there's something very central planny about the idea of a Dyson Swarm. It's like, well, suddenly someone decided to make a Dyson Swarm. What? Why? Why would someone do that?
Well, here are my attempted answers, right? So
yeah,
I agree that there is a question of what the hell is anyone doing with the Dyson Swarm? And I don't think I have a good answer to that question. I would say that for me doesn't feel like a strong reason to expect it not to happen. And I say that because it seems like if you can figure out a way to get this kind of self-growing process, then it could just be very cheap to begin in, right?
But I'm saying the counterfactual. So it's like you could do a self-growing process for Dyson Swarm, but maybe there's alternative self-growing processes to do other things. And so
And here I think my tentative claim would be that there may just not be more valuable uses, alternative uses to these resources. So we're talking about, in our solar system, asteroids or planetary bodies like Mercury. You're not going to be sending this back to Earth, probably. That's a bit crazy. You can build other structures, but the way that you build other structures, basically whatever end structure you want, if you want as much of it as possible, then step one is grow this kind of general manufacturing machinery as much as possible. And you do that by something that has to look like a Dyson swarm, right? Because a Dyson swarm just means a way to collect as much of the sun's energy as possible and then to build more energy collectors, right? And you can just be agnostic about the end product.
No, but that's what I'm saying is it's so focused on energy as an input to the production of goods. But goods are produced by a million things. So I just say, like Dyson swarm is defined as, you harvest, a large fraction of energy from a star. And I just don't understand. Like, I believe that there will be self-replication, space colonization, but I don't see why it would be so focused on the bottleneck energy. What I'm imagining is, no, things grow up in stages and you get some energy, you get some other resources. You do that as much as, that's efficient. But then you're doing other things too,
You need to focus on energy. So, you've got this concept where you send a seed space, you tip it off to start building a lot of stuff. One hypothesis is you should just build as much energy production as possible because that's very useful. A pushback there would be, not as possible. Like, you don't want to maybe convert 100% of the mass of the solar system to energy because you really like to be able to build one probe to send to the next solar system, right? Like, you're incurring an opportunity cost for the stuff that you decide to devote to the Dyson swarm versus some other thing. And where the optimum is a hard question. Like, probably like my hypothesis and Simon's thing would be you just kind of set that by thinking about markets you could address in the future or something like that. And then even if you're going to build Dyson swarms, like one real question you should ask is like, should I build all the Dyson swarms now or should I wait 6 months until the Dyson swarms are going to be a little bit better? Like each module will be like a little bit more efficient, right? I actually don't even want to necessarily like blow all of my capital on, even if I was just going to do energy, on like the energy production I could do by setting it off today. And like, we're doing, post AGI kind of long-termism. So it's a hot science switch in flavor, but these are very normal commercial trade-offs that in like all the different markets that exist.
So one thing you said was, look, it's not given that this has to be at a, fully like process of sheer self-reproduction. And the same with the economy is not just, 100% savings rate and it's just reinvesting everything into growth, right? People want to consume. Sure, like seems totally possible that maybe along the way towards building something like a Dyson swarm, then you're skimming off, energy and you're diverting it towards forms of consumption. I feel like that doesn't massively change the picture.
Well, I meant that even if you were just trying to grow maximally, you don't want 100% of the stuff you build to be solar collectors. You want some share to be your seed Dyson probes to send like elsewhere. So, like there is a trade-off you're incurring.
Or there's a million things. What about investment in new R&D to make innovate? So one thing I could imagine, for example, I feel we're getting far from Dyson swarm. The question is like, what's the most efficient?
I think a lot of these questions apply to Earth as well after AGI.
Yeah. So what's the most efficient self-replicating space colonization project? And I don't see why it would so over-index on energy. I would think you send a thing that sets up a civilization with a bunch of minds, and then that civilization is doing all sorts of stuff. And then it gets some energy, but then it's doing other things too. And maybe ultimately it gets all the energy.
Like we don't figure out how much energy to make, and oh my God, how can we figure it out? One possibility is we're trying to like think about the global end state and start a system. It's like our different thing is because you could ask how much people are willing to pay for the marginal unit.
Yeah, I mean, one way to put the question is not, okay, there's some hypothesized end state, how do you race towards it? It's more just, look, the economy, at least a market economy, you can approximate it as just maximizing growth given its constraints, right? Of course, there's no planner doing that. This is kind of a consequence of actors within the market. So, okay, like post-AGI, what kind of configuration of the economy grows fastest, and that could tell us about what to expect. I think it's plausible to me that, of course, there'll be many, complementary factors to growth, right? As there always will be. Like, this just is a fact about the world that won't change. But one thing that may change is because you're plausibly no longer so bottlenecked by human labor, you can just set off these processes of self-reproducing manufacturing so cheaply that, of course, you just go ahead and do that, right? And okay, you need to do the R&D and everything else as well. But it costs just like such a negligible fraction of your output to just initiate these processes. And then the opportunity cost that they're eating up is small, because what else are you going to do with these asteroids or whatever? So that's an argument to expect these like physical processes.
So here's my counter. My counter is what will actually be the most efficient way of doing space colonization is self-replicating liberalism, where you send out a probe that creates a giant liberal market and government in each place the probe goes, and then that liberal market and government then decides to send out new probes and stuff. And then my claim is, even if some people start sending out these crappy Dyson swarm probes initially, overall, they'll be dramatically outcompeted by the liberal self-replicating swarms, because if you do swarm liberalism, each point in the swarm liberalism network will behave much more efficiently than these crappy points where they just go there and just get lots of energy, because trying to get lots of energy is going to be less efficient than having a market, because the market is the most efficient way to deal with resources. Yeah, so that's what I think is the von Neumann liberal probes will actually outcompete the Dyson swarm probes. That's my hypothesis.
I mean, part of my question, I will just comment. I don't know what this looks like. Like, do you have consumers who are going out to the...
Here's what it looks like. So it's going to use digital mines probably, and you send out your probe, and it starts mining energy and resources, and then it makes a bunch of digital mines, and then it gives them all an initial seed of some resources, and then it does a big auction for the region that it goes to, and doles out the region to the digital mines that it created. And then the digital mines own that region, and they do markets there. And then they do markets as extracting the resources there, and then they make their trade-off. So that's what it looks like.
And there's an interesting question about how you want to design the utility function of the digital mines. It's like one possibility is they're all like exact copies, because that they have all the best preferences, but they index their utility indexically. So they all have like lots of very similar preferences, but they're going around doing different stuff and thus have different information, and that produces different price signals. A different thing will be you like want to have uncertainty about what preferences you should have, and so you vary them somewhat, and you do the competition that way.
I wonder if in some way you're right, but the difference is small. Like the digital mines, they're thinking, what do I really want? Well, I want more compute. That's just the generic kind of unit of account that I care about. How do I get more compute? Well, I route to getting more energy, and everything else that's required to build more stuff. But we've done the R&D already, so okay, it looks like a Dyson swarm.
Yeah, but it could be. It could be if you. I mean, like,
who thought energy was all that mattered? Is the communists. The communists thought that. It's more space communism. It's like, oh well, we've centrally planned. We know that the best thing is we just got to get all of the steel and the oil out of the asteroids, and that'll work best. But then the alternative is, no. We don't know what the most efficient way of managing the resources is. So that's why we send out liberalism.
Okay, cool. We are all back after a short break. We were talking about the case for markets post-AGI. We're going to talk about democracy next, but I want to give you both a chance to add anything that hasn't been mentioned yet.
Well, just as a snapshot of the analysis in the paper, there's a bunch of other kinds of market failures, and we think one of the most interesting and controlling factors in analyzing those is the falling transaction costs in the far future with new technologies. So in general, as transaction cost falls, we expect markets to become much more efficient. And one way to see that is with the role of externalities. So, classically, once transaction costs fall, it becomes much easier to properly price externalities, because all the people affected can just contract directly with the affecting party. So if you have a polluter, you have a polluting firm that's causing a tiny bit of problem for a million different people. Well, maybe in the far future, each person's AI agent can liaise with the AI agent of the polluting firm, and they can all work out a contract to pay the firm not to pollute. And then, that's one way to resolve the externality. And then you can do further tax and transfer to deal with resulting inequalities. But the point is you get the socially optimal amount of pollution. And anyway, so those kinds of dynamics we think tend to favor. That's, one way that the far future tends to look pretty good for markets is falling transaction costs. And this is related to what people sometimes call the Coasean singularity.
Yeah, I love this idea. I think it's underrated. It's one thing to talk about transaction costs being generically low, and I buy that they may, decrease with AGI. It is, in practice, often hard to imagine how you get the kind of Coasean outcomes in practice, even if you do in theory, when you're imagining negotiations between any large number of people, right? Like kind of bilateral cases are very easy to picture, maybe 3 or 4 actors, okay, fine. If you imagine a case where I'm imposing an externality on, tens of thousands of people, and I can't easily, slice up that externality to turn it into a bunch of bilateral agreements, then just in practice, you have these like really, really wicked holdout and free riding problems. Seems like it is actually quite hard for AI to solve that.
Yeah, very interesting. There, I would be reaching for some of the tools in the Weil and Posner book, Radical Markets, as general technologies for solving holdout problems. But yes, those are very interesting.
Okay, great. And yeah, readers can go and Google that. Let's talk about democracy. So this is the other piece to your arguments, right? You're kind of, talking about markets and democracy as a combination. Okay, one case for democracy is that it, aggregates voter preferences. And then there are these, political processes that turn the result into policy. You might think, well, in the future, in a planned or autocratic system, just like we were talking about with markets, there's just much less of a problem of knowing what voters would want and figuring out how to generate it, right? Because you can basically surveil people, or you can otherwise just elicit preferences in much more detail. Is that not a reason for thinking, for better or worse, that these democratic processes just aren't as useful once we have better technology?
We're pretty sympathetic to the idea that epistemic arguments for democracy are less effective in the far future. So one argument for democracy is that it's a good way of aggregating information because of jury theorems and that sort of thing. But crucially, we actually ourselves don't think that the epistemic arguments for democracy are the end-all and be-all of the arguments for democracy. Rather, we think some of the more exciting arguments for democracy are public choice arguments about how democracy affects the incentives of leaders, and then also commitment kind of arguments about how democracy solves commitment problems between different groups. And so those are the ones that we think persist into the far future. But I'm sympathetic that the epistemic arguments may not work.
So one reason we think that the epistemic arguments get weaker is, so a classic thing people say about democracies is, part of what's going on when you're voting on policies, you're predicting what will happen. Will this, tax policy make growth go up or down or something like that. And things like the Condorcet jury theorem and other sort of more complicated jury theorems say, well, if each voter is a little bit better than random at making that prediction, and then some other assumptions like, the votes are independent and some other things, that as you get more voters, you converge towards really good predictions about the future. But there's clearly an asymptote to that effect, where either you get lots and lots more voters, each of whom is slightly better than random, or the voters get more better than random. And so at some point you just sort of run out of juice to wring out of the voter theorems. And we think that in a world where either you have very smart AIs casting votes or very many AIs casting votes who are just a little bit smarter than random or something like that, you get there pretty quickly. I'm not sure it's quite the same argument you raised. I think the argument you raised is closer to the question, like, will you need the question we discussed before about whether you need actually to run markets to elicit preferences, or whether you can just read them off, behavior, or read them off of the neurons or something like that. There I'd say the same thing, which is like maybe, but probably just like to get a preference about a particular good, you need the simulation to be extremely rich, because it needs to be a question not just about like how much somebody likes something, but like what all their relevant alternatives are, and like how much like wealth they have and what their prospects are for their future job. It's like all kinds of things that feed into people's economic decisions. And I think you'd say the same about voting decisions. So like maybe in principle you can simulate all this, but in the limit, it seems like it converges to like simulating the whole polity, including all the voters, and then reading their preferences off of the actual like simulated ballots you've handed the simulated people in the simulated world. And like, is that a democracy? Is that not a democracy? Complicated, weird thing. And there's like there's the digital democracy, then that kind of supervenes on top of the real world or something like that.
There are epistemic arguments for democracy. Plausibly, they are not the strongest arguments for democracy post-AGI. But Simon, you said that there are other arguments to do with public choice and to do with kinds of commitment. Happy to hear about either of those things.
Exactly. So we can take each in turn. So the first argument is about incentives. And the idea is, well, actually, the reason democracy outperforms autocrats is that democratic leaders have different incentives than autocratic leaders. Both democratic leaders and autocratic leaders broadly want the same thing. They want to stay in power. They want to amass resources for themselves, but they're operating they're playing different games. And so then they have different tools available to them. And so we really like, one extremely influential kind of model of this in political science is called selectorate theory. And here the idea is, okay, basically leaders are trying to stay in power, but whether they stay in power depends on various parties in the broader society. And basically there's the set of all people who have some say of some kind in who is the leader, and that's the selectorate. And then there's the subset of that actually causes their candidates to win, which is the winning coalition. And so then in selectorate theory, you kind of analyze leader incentives through ratios of the size of the winning coalition to the selectorate. And so, canonically, in democracies, you need a majority of the selectorate, which is like the voters, to elect you. And then, okay, how do those incentives matter in practice? Well, the basic idea is leaders are taxing, and then they take the tax revenue and they can spend it on three things. They can just keep the money themselves, or they can give the money to their winning coalition, or they can give the money to everybody. And so private goods are when they just like give Lamborghini. It's like when a monarch gives Lamborghinis to the, nobles or something. And then public goods are the ones that are non-rivalrous. And so that's like education and things. So if you spend money on public goods, that tends to be the most efficient way to convert money into general welfare. And so then the general intuition in selectorate theory is that democracies go better because leaders in democracies have a stronger incentive to spend money on public goods rather than private goods. And the reason for that is that the larger your winning coalition is, the harder it is to pay them to vote for you through private goods. It's easier to pay them to vote for you through public goods because private goods, there's no kind of agglomeration benefits to them. And so that's the overall. So that's like a famous argument for democracy. And then, we just think, and so then the methodology is, does that argument extend into the far future? And then we think, there's no real reason why not. The relevant causal variable in the far future, I guess, would be kind of the relative efficiency of private and public goods. And so as long as there's still lots of public goods out there in the future, then there's a question of whether leaders in the far future will invest in public goods or private goods. And then, it's better when they invest in public goods. And if they are a leader of a democracy, then they're more likely to invest in the public goods. That's kind of the argument.
Others, including my colleagues, have worried that this kind of selectorate theory approach, when you try to extend it to a world of AGI, makes autocracy look more, let's say, competitive, because as an autocrat, in principle, you don't need to rely so much on a kind of coalition of bureaucrats and fixers in order to remain in power. And so you don't need to kind of hold together in terms of maintaining secrecy and in terms of paying out bribes a large coalition. So if you're just in a place to grab power as an individual or a very small group, it's suddenly easier to do that than it was historically. I'm kind of curious what you make of those arguments since we're talking about this.
It's easier because, for example, you might be able to seize power with the help of a extremely loyal, very capable AI system or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, why is it difficult in a democracy or a kind of quasi-democracy currently to just massively entrench your power and just stop caring about what voters want and the result of elections? Well, things are structured that you as an individual just rely and are really just subject to, kind of webs of other people. And you just can't get what you want without relying on other people to carry out your instructions. But if, you can just replace all your bureaucrats with robot bureaucrats, right? And you can make them perfectly loyal. Well, that's kind of a world where you should be more worried about stories where power gets kind of centralized and entrenched in the executive, for example.
Well, selective theory doesn't predict that nobody wants to be an autocrat or that you can never do it, right? Selective theory is more a theory about why democracies seem to be so much better for the world in the long run. And the basic idea is this public goods provision is really good because it's kind of the engine of growth. It's like you're educating people that are coming up with new ideas. Technology drives growth and endogenous growth theory. In selective theory, like an autocracy can be perfectly stable so long as it is indeed the case that you only need a few people as part of the winning coalition. Then you can just expropriate the rest of society and pay those people off. So within selective theory, there's not a guarantee this doesn't happen. I mean, one thing it predicts is that in the long run, you get more successful and bigger democracies and autocracies over time. I mean, I think we probably observe that empirically in the real world too. So it does place some structural limitation on like the ratio of economic and maybe like citizen mass inside of autocracies versus democracies, but it doesn't prevent this particular problem. I think it's something we should really worry about. Some of the other arguments for democracy, I think, do go more to these kinds of dynamics. So like a famous argument from Acemoglu and Robinson for why the West extends the franchise is this idea that there are some privileged people in society and they have like a lot of the resources and maybe they're gaining a lot from growth or something like that. And then there are a whole bunch of people who have a lot less. And those people would like to have some of the resources and some of the growth. And the aristocrats, the privileged people, don't really want to give it to them, but they're worried that the less privileged people will have a revolution and they'll take all the stuff, and actually that'll be worse because the revolution will be costly, there'll be less stuff to go around. And so the privileged group, the aristocrats or whomever, the first approximation, they say, okay, well, how about we just give all of you people some stuff? Here's some bread and circuses or whatever. That seems like it should work because it seems like it pays off the less privileged classes. But then the worry among the less privileged classes rationally is that the aristocrats will then just re-expropriate all the stuff as soon as the sort of revolutionary moment has died down. And a way of making this credible is by changing the political system by which the decision to expropriate or not gets made, by extending the franchise to everybody and allowing them to have a say in whether they get re-expropriated in the rate of tax. So like, how does this apply to the AI autocracy model? I mean, one thing to say is like, it seems really important that for democracies to work and this credibility mechanism to continue to work, that like people do continue to have the say in what the government does. And you probably don't get that by default. Like you can imagine a very bad world where there's, a runaway singleton superintelligence and it ends up in the hands of a leader who decides they'd like to use it to do a coup, and uses that power they seize to shut down all other kinds of development in society that could challenge the power. And then like autocracy is possible, right? Like we observe it in the real world. What does this mean from a policy perspective? I mean, I think it means like you should really try to make sure that democracy is working well. You should really try to preserve democracy, including the parts of democracy that allow like regular people, the citizens more broadly, to maintain their ability to make decisions about what the government does. I mean, the classic mechanism that is voting, but you can run voting through a whole bunch of other stuff, like how you empower the government or not to use the military, which is the classic channel for coups, and then you can extend it to how you empower the government or not procure and use AI. It's a big risk. It seems like the best way to manage this is by really trying to get the polity, the voters, to make informed and smart decisions about how their political leaders are and are not able to cut them out of the decision-making process.
It's one thing to talk about democracy in the abstract. I'm worried that I'm too much conflating that in my head with, majoritarian, one person, one vote, elections every 4 years kind of democracy. And there's a very wide space of arrangements. Some people like to talk about the kind of new kinds of democratic technologies we could get, right? Especially with AI, right? We have these kind of deliberation procedures, and you have these very high bandwidth ways of kind of giving inputs to governance processes. I'm kind of interested how excited you are about the kind of new technological possibilities for democracy, or is it more just a case that actually you kind of get most of the way with the basics? The important thing is not how fancy it is technologically, but it's just the basic kind of incentives you're setting.
The technology of democracy has changed a lot in the last, I don't know, however long you think we've had democracy in the world. When we think about sort of the American founding, one big technology of democracy was pamphlets. It was this incredible ability to write down some marketing for the Constitution in the form of the Federalist Papers, and to send hundreds or thousands of copies around America for people to read. Oh my God, what a technology of democracy. Then we had radio and TV and social media and all these other things. And surely AI progress will not only allow us to have new technology of democracy, but just impose it on us. I don't think we really have a choice of whether we'll have new technology of democracy. We maybe have a choice of how we shape them. And I'm in favor of both policies, but also I think market solutions to making it go well. One thing I've been really encouraged by is the findings so far that LLMs are in some way the opposite of social media, where social media dynamics tend to surface the most deranged views and push people towards more extreme views. But now on Twitter, you can at Grok, and Grok, for whatever you think its foibles are, is in many ways grounded in reality, and will tell people that they're wrong, and that people in fact view this as a fairly impartial arbiter of at least certain kinds of questions. And nobody mandated that by policy. We kind of invented this new technology that maybe is making democracy better at the margin. But at a higher level, I think a lot of what's going on, or a lot of the attention, if we're worried about AI autocracy, should be at least as much on the incentive structures as on the technology itself. Of course, we want to have good alignment technology. Of course, we want the models we deploy in government to follow the law and have generally good values and not do weird stuff. But just as important are questions like, how is the distribution of control over the deployed models spread across the government? Is there, does Congress have AI in addition to the executive? And to what extent do bureaucrats have access to these things? And to what extent does is there an easy technological or legal political mechanism for say the president to just press one button and then go on intercom to all of the Claude instances deployed in the entire executive and give them a different command? And if he indeed does that, who would or wouldn't face liability for facilitating or preventing him having done that? Those all seem like questions that are just as important as the question of what technology we'll have. I think they're probably comparatively underrated. There are people who are doing interesting, good work on this. The people at Law AI have good stuff on this. Proposals around, for example, giving Congress basically a pre-approval right for for executive procurements and uses of AI models. The idea that I think Colin O'Keefe has seems good. Seems like we should have more ideas like that.
So, I mean, one case for democracy that at least I'm very sympathetic to is this kind of Popper style attitude where democracy is about error correction, right? It's not so much about aggregating preferences and maximizing social welfare. It's just a release valve for, bad experiments in governance, right? You kind of give some amount of freedom to political leaders or to a government, and then you trust the democratic process to deliver a verdict on whether it's failed. There's a lot going for this. I think it is historically quite easy to know if an experiment in government has failed, and it's much harder and maybe in some ways you might think less of even a well-defined question to talk about what is ideal or best, right? I'm curious what you think about the worry that, as much as I think this is, to date, a very good argument, if you're thinking about how do we get, truly great futures which are achieving all this potential value that we haven't yet achieved, maybe that will require doing things which are not obvious, in the sense that if we don't do them as a society or don't get them, it won't be very salient to voters that we're falling short in some way. Like, a basic example would just be how big is the future, right? So it's just not, wasn't salient to the world 300 years ago when fewer than 1 billion people were alive, that it could be 10x bigger. And that in some sense, that's a huge deal. But I expect there are lots of other examples. I'm kind of, interested in what you make of that kind of limitation to democracy.
Yeah, I mean, it is one question to ask is like, okay, but what's the alternative? Like, an interesting thing about the past was much smaller. And how did we get to a pretty big present compared to the past? Well, you can debate what caused the Industrial Revolution, but there's like a strong correlation between the institutions that instituted markets and democratic governance, or the places that instituted that, and the places that really did grow, both in terms of GDP output. I guess maybe population sort of diverges from this a little bit. I don't know. You have different views about how good or bad that is. The point being that nobody in 1791, when the American framers were ratifying the Constitution, was saying, and this is going to be such a good system because think of how many Americans we're going to produce with this system. It turns out that bigness and growth fall out a lot. I think primarily for markets, but with good governance of them that comes from democracy.
I guess one response there is maybe we got lucky. It seems plausibly in rich democracies population will decline. I don't know if that's I'm not saying that's the most important thing in the world, but at least the connection between this outcome that may or may not be good and democratic market economies is at least somewhat contingent. But maybe a better example for what it's worth would be something like factory farming, where I think, quite reasonable to think this is an extremely bad thing and kind of, moral stain on the world. Democratic countries are, just as happy to go and factory farm animals as autocratic countries. Seems like there are not especially strong trends in a positive direction. In some way, that's pretty understandable. As a voter, it just doesn't directly influence you. In fact, it would be, mildly bad if you had to pay more for your food or whatever. Do we not get lots of examples like that?
And can I just flag, I think there's a deeper thing going on, which is that the game theoretic dynamics that tend to encourage democracy and encourage markets require that the participants be powerful enough. So I think really the dynamic you're pointing to with factory farming is, well, when you have a bunch of people who matter for social welfare, or agents who matter for social welfare, but they're not powerful enough to be game theoretically relevant, markets and democracy will tend to neglect them. So I think that's true. There, though, I think, the long run question is there's also the agents who are game theoretically significant tend to have altruistic concern. And so then there's a question of how much that in the long run will end up kind of allowing them in. I do think, besides from animals, the other category there for the far future would be digital minds. But I do expect that digital minds will be kind of players in game theory. And so I do think there are a lot of trends that will tend to avoid analogous failure modes to happen for digital minds.
See our previous episode.
In some moods, I feel that the error correction stuff is a bit of a red herring. And like there's a different perspective to the arguments that go like this. You're talking about getting the very best futures and then errors on getting the very best futures. But like the key arguments about the best futures are really the market arguments that from the theorems, for the fundamental theorems, you get that if there are not market failures, you can tax and transfer your way to a Pareto efficient allocation. And so then that's what's getting you the best futures you can. And then the role of democracy is just making that all work. And then there's just two aspects of that. One aspect is dealing with correcting market. There are two functions of democracy. Then one is correcting market failures and the other is doing tax and transfer. And then if you think about the arguments we ran, basically the selectorate theory argument is about externalities because it's saying, well, one of the most important market failures is failing to deliver positive externalities, and public goods are the canonical way to do that. And so then that's the argument that democracies are good for externalities. And then on tax and transfer, basically, that's coming in with the Acemoglu argument about commitment. And then the other aspect of the commitment argument is, well, if markets just get blown up through revolution, then that's a lot of deadweight loss. And so commitment, or just another way to say that is that commitment problems are another kind of market failure. And so then, that I don't completely agree with that whole way of thinking about it, but that's at least one mood that I get into. But then even there, your last question about animals is still relevant because then the point would be, well, that's really challenging the relevance of the fundamental theories because if there's entities that contribute to social welfare but are not included in market transactions, then that would be basically that's another kind of market failure.
Yeah. But what do you make of this point that it just matters, what beings exist when you're thinking about how good is the future, right? And you can make all these arguments for a given population of enfranchised beings. And you can say, if there are kind of people or beings that matter that are not enfranchised, well, let's enfranchise them. You can say, well, as long as you're worried about inequality or market failures, well, that's why we want kind of, functional markets and these tax and transfer kind of schemes. Fine. I think that is quite persuasive. But what if it just requires, to get a great future, like some insane number of digital minds spread out across the universe? And what are the arguments to think that the kind of liberal democratic process just gravitates towards these kind of very sci-fi futures where it seems to me also compatible with democracy and liberalism and markets that, at some point everyone becomes immortal because they can technologically. People don't really want to create more people because, you just get more resources for yourself that way. Look, do I think this is likely? No, but it seems possible, right?
Yeah. So we do have a section about that in our analysis of discount rates and temporal discounting, which we take to be another kind of market failure. So the one big issue, I think, in what you said is, you said, well, if people are immortal, they're thinking, don't make more people because that'll leave less resources for yourself. But because I think that is a zero-sum thinking. Because we're thinking differently. We're thinking, no. More agents means more opportunities for trade, and it's valuable to have agents are a great way of converting resources into assets. And then the argument we run about temporal discounting is that the longer you live, the more you're going to care about the future. And then as you start to care about the future more, another key fact is that the more people that exist, the more agglomeration benefits you get. And so then if you care more about the future, you'll also care about your own future. You'll care more about more people existing because then you get to capture the agglomeration. So for example, every new person is an opportunity to create new ideas or other new non-rivalrous goods, other public goods with positive externalities. So that's the argument we run for better.
Okay, yeah, it makes sense. But if let's say you become immortal and you care about bringing about these new market players that can go and give you these agglomeration effects. They can kind of come up with new ideas for you. They can trade with you. It seems to me like they don't need to matter in a kind of moral or all things considered sense, right? If anything, it'd be inefficient for them to, be capable of experiencing joy and meaning and whatever else. You just want them to be economic machines as long as you're selfish.
Depends what moral status amounts to, but I think it is important that they be agents with preferences, because agents with preferences, it depends what you mean by preferences, but at least it's important that they have dispositions to systematically promote goals, because otherwise you're not going to be able to get much from them. And then, at least I myself am very tempted by conceptions of welfare where that's sufficient to count towards welfare.
Yeah, like one other like structural mechanism that's like we're thinking about in this space. I'm not sure exactly how it applies to the question of whether the agents you create have welfare or not. Is not only do you maybe have a reason to create all the agents for the future who will go create a lot of stuff, and a lot of it will be non-rivalrous, it'll be ideas, it'll be growth, that'll be kind of redound to your benefit directly. The other thing is, like, you could in principle be bargaining with the agents you create directly, right? Like, the agent could exist or not. And if the existence is negative, like, I don't know, I guess it kills itself. And if existence is positive and you create it or not, you can in theory split that surplus using some kind of contractual mechanism or legislative mechanism. And then I guess the more good it is, the more you can split the surplus, right? The more you can. And so I guess it's like, this probably doesn't redound, this probably doesn't go exactly to whether the agent matters morally, if you think that you need something more than strong preferences to matter morally. Like it's not clear that an agent would pay a consciousness premium for you giving it consciousness, if that's what you think matters. But this is like all part of the design space for, like, once it becomes trivially, like, once something's very cheap and easy to create more agents, you need to make various kinds of bargains with the agent you create or not.
What do you make of this? So I take the current question to be, do markets and democracy, necessarily kind of generate the most valuable futures, especially in terms of the number of beings, or whether they kind of morally count as well as economically, or do these things come apart? Different question you could ask is, to the extent that you are morally motivated, just as an actor, should you want to, and you want to kind of create beings that matter in some way, should you do that with a kind of central planner hat on, or should you want them to exist in some kind of, market-like society with some kind of democratic features? And on that question, it seems like maybe you should, to the extent you want to bring about morally relevant beings, you should want them to have certain kinds of freedoms, which are, which I associate with liberal democracy, right? So, freedoms to go and choose what they go out and do and get, and freedoms to trade, and also freedoms, in some sense, to kind of opt out of everything if they choose. That seems in some ways safer than the kind of centrally planned alternative.
If you buy the arguments for markets from and for democracy from growth, if you either want the agents you create to consume more or for there to be more wealth for more agents to consume, right? If things going morally well for the kinds of agents you're planning to create depends on them having wealth, you should really want to put them in the system that's going to generate the most wealth for them to consume, even if you're totally altruistic, you don't care about it redounding to your own benefit. And so I think that's an argument that you should have your democracy hat on. Now, look, like, none of these things are like totally pure, right? Like, you said, oh, maybe if you're interested in the welfare of these agents, you should give them a lot of freedom, a lot of choice, which are associated with liberal systems. Like, that's probably true, but it's all true. You kind of have to make choices when you make the things, right? Like, you have to endow them with an initial set of goals or preferences, their values, or something like that. It's like there's not an alternative. I mean, you can randomize, I guess, across the whole space of possible values, but that's still a kind of choice we made. And I think we have this in regular life today too. Like, we have children, and they have some baked in preferences and values because of genetics or whatever, but then we spend a lot of time trying to shape them and give them good ones. And is that a kind of planning? I don't know. Maybe, I guess we could make mistakes. Maybe they can engage in kind of metacognition, and they can think about what would be the best preferences to have, and they can change them. Or maybe that's confused in some ways. I'm not totally sure But like this is all like very much stuff within the design space of doing liberalism. But I also just want to like step back one step and like just make a point across this whole suite of possibilities, which is like, okay, maybe you're worried that for the future to go well, there has to be like some slightly weird kind of thing that has to happen. Maybe that thing is creating a lot of minds that matter and seeding them across the universe. And maybe there's some arguments for why democracy won't do that. There's some probability it will, some probability it won't, and you can calibrate your probability based on various arguments. Even then, I think Simon and I both think the real thing you should be asking is like, is there a different institutional arrangement that will give you higher credence that those things will happen?
I worry that the alternative is, okay, make an AI, make it a hedonist utilitarian, and have it take over the universe. Sometimes I feel that's sort of the implicit alternative is AI, hedonic utilitarian autocracy forever. And yeah, I don't like that as an alternative for various reasons.
Well, it's good if you really bought in on hedonic utilitarianism and you have high credence in AI alignment.
No, but even if I bought in on hedonic utilitarianism, I think many of the arguments we gave are still arguments against that because of stability in things. So like that's not a credible commitment device. So there's going to be a much higher chance of revolution. Now, if it's super intelligent, maybe no one can ever overthrow it. So then it's like we don't need the public choice in game theory is irrelevant because the super intelligent AI overlord can't be overthrown. So you can go down that horn, that's at least one concrete alternative. I think it's good to be concrete because that's one of the issues Peter and I felt is we're often chasing phantoms where we don't understand our view is the answers aren't that interesting because it's standard liberal institutions. And then we don't understand what the alternatives are that people are advocating.
Yeah, that seems totally right. And I guess this can go two ways, right? One is once you're forced to spell out the alternative that is not just extending liberal democratic institutions, plus answering some questions that come up on the way, maybe it turns out that your answer is just infeasible because it's not an extension of what we already have going and is, therefore in some way politically illegitimate and kind of therefore unworkable. So that's one possibility. The other possibility is that it's politically illegitimate and feasible, or at least you think it's feasible, in which case it's really worth just pressing on that and, just being a bit concrete on, okay, like maybe this is in some way the kind of max EV plan for the future, but let's kind of be clear-eyed that it is in some way illiberal or not preferred by most people. And I kind of agree, like it's, it's not very useful to like tread around that possibility if it is the case.
So like Plato famously favored philosophical autocracy, and said some stuff about democracy and didn't like it very much. And that seems like a feasible, like politically feasible system. Like we observe autocracies, and we even historically observed some enlightened autocracies. Like it's possible to have an autocracy that produces a lot of goods for the society that it governs. And you could imagine arguments, like you could imagine arguments for the transition to AGI and the long-term future that say something like, yes, there are all these really good arguments for liberalism, but the mechanisms that give you the results will like not work well either in the transition to AGI and beyond. And therefore, while it's really scary to be advocating like, autocracy by philosopher king, we actually think that for, a specific set of reasons, that's the EV maxing strategy. And I can imagine an argument like that. And that would be like a really interesting argument to engage with. I don't know that anyone's making it explicitly though. And like you can't really evaluate it unless we make it in that explicit way.
My sense of some of the kind of conversations, at least in forethought about what would Viatopia look like, I think basically none of them do look like, take over the world and tile it with the best thing. And they look a lot more like some kind of high octane democracy that tries to factor in a lot of these technological changes. And then I wonder if the thing you'd hear from these people is, Yeah, like it probably should be democratic and liberal in some sense, but for the reasons you give. But the space of possible liberal democratic institutions and futures is so unbelievably wide, and there are so many to date unanswered questions about the kind of technologies we get down the line, that's really just where all the action is. And is this in some way, should we be thinking of this as a continuation of today's institutions or a break with them that are nonetheless in some sense importantly still democratic? Who's to say, but it feels very kind of wide open in that sense.
I agree with that. I think probably Simon does too. But even there, I think there's like a lot of traction you can get by thinking about these questions in these like institutional mechanistic terms that we're trying to advocate for in the paper. Like for example, like Forsyth has this paper on moral public goods in the future, and we say a lot of stuff about public goods in the paper, and I think there's a real live question about like whether the public goods that we're going to care about in the future are like a fundamentally different structure, such that the way we'll need to produce them will be something weird, like, I don't know, solving a causal trade, or whether like we'll do pretty well with kind of the normal stuff, like subsidies, for example. And I think there's a lot of that going on. I think in addition to like sometimes not totally knowing what the proposal is without more concreteness. Like I think another thing that would be good to produce more of in the space of people who are trying to think about policy design for the post-AGI world in the far future. Yeah, just like more engagement with these like very standard approaches to doing things, and like treating them more as the null hypothesis than I think is currently the norm.
Yeah, I was gonna, as a quick wrap-up thing, I just wanted to read a quick vision of the future that we have, which I think I have not seen in the long-termist stuff.
Excellent.
Okay.
Please.
So imagine that humanity successfully colonizes a large fraction of the light cone. There are untold planets teeming with life. The relevant agents form a spectrum from biological to non-biological substrates. Humans and AIs interact in many different ways. This vast civilization uses markets to allocate resources. Trade occurs at various levels of abstraction, at various timescales, and for a wide range of goods. The civilization is governed democratically. Within this broadly liberal setting, there are endless variations in the details of governance. Some planets are relatively isolated, governing themselves with relatively little outside input. Large swaths of the light cone have agreed to various basic constitutional ground rules necessary to at least engage in peaceful international relations. There is a vast hierarchy of federated levels, which weaken in the strength of their requirements as their breadth expands. In this imagined scenario, the economy is almost unrecognizable from today in terms of the specific goods and services supplied, but the basic tools of markets and democratic institutions are still used to decide questions of allocation, growth, and governance.
Who could disagree with that? Yeah, is there anything that either of you feel like hasn't been touched on or said that you'd be keen to mention? I mean, one thing may be like enfranchising AIs. Is that not kind of crazy? And is that not just gradual disempowerment by other words?
The answer is enfranchising AI seems probably good, insofar as we think AIs will be game theoretically relevant agents in the way we talked about in the section on, credible commitment, and like one big worry that we and I think other people who worry about the future of AI have is the possibility of what's sometimes called rogue AI, but you could, I think, just as easily say AI rebellion or revolution. And yeah, one really, really classic public choice political theory thing to say about that is you increase the risk of revolution by disenfranchising and you decrease it by enfranchising. As we said before, it remains like quite important in democratic governance for the theories of democracy that all the parties who you want to have influence in fact remain game theoretically relevant agents. So you don't want your policy to in the long run make any of the relevant parties irrelevant. So you don't want to gradually disempower humans by giving AIs the franchise. But we don't think that follows directly. Like there's a bunch of channels that people sort of flag the possibility of gradual disempowerment. One of them is that AI labor will substitute for all the human labor, and so humans won't have any influence on the economy anymore. But we think there's just like a lot of steps from AIs are very good at jobs to that outcome that you have to analyze quite carefully. And some of them are policy steps, and some of them are economic steps. Like the obvious policy step is well taxation. So if you're taxing a lot of the AI labor, and then the money and the resources fall back kind of to everybody, that means they still get to keep influencing markets via their consumption preferences. Demand side is extremely important. Like what are the AIs doing? Well, if people are buying things, and they're going to be doing things that people like.
And I'd just like to highlight that a little more. I mean, just again, our methodology is look at standard liberal tools. And for a standard liberal, tax and transfer is the number one tool for dealing with problems. And so it's like, if you're worried that AIs are going to, gradually accumulate power, the first tool you reach for is tax and transfer. And just in general, we'd like to see long-termists more work within the standard tools and just like have the instinct, like, oh, if there's a problem, the tax transfer. That's got to have the liberal instinct because we have the tools, Yeah,
I mean, it could be the tax transfer doesn't work, but like it's like you should really be boring first. And then the other boring stuff about the economy is like many questions around like when and how trade can persist between different kinds of agents. It doesn't resolve the question to say one agent is strictly better at all jobs. Actually, comparative advantage makes it very complicated. And it can be the case, actually, the better the smarter agent is at the job, the more the agent's willing to pay for lower value jobs, depending on what constraint is labor at the margin. There's just many things to work through doing this.
Another way I feel this is all going wrong is that many of the gradual disempowerment questions from AI are actually dialectically isomorphic to questions about immigration. So you get the same questions. This is when you have new immigrants enter a population, then there's a worry, are they going to disempower? And then the answer is, well, no, because they grow the total share of goods because there's trade, and then you can do tax and transfer to deal with all this stuff. So it's all the exact same dialectic, and it's the same tools, and it's the same problem, So that's one reason I get frustrated, is I find it a bit exhausting how it, I feel we're recapitulating the same structural questions. Yes, we're talking about new entrants to a population participating in the existing institutions. How does that work? Well, we know a lot about how that works, Now, there's lots of specific questions that are unique to AI, but the general notion of disempowerment from new entrants into an economy is actually, that's already one of the most salient political issues of our time,
Okay, well, the question is left to the listener, I suppose. Let's begin to wrap up. I kind of want to ask you both, people listening to this who presumably can do some thinking, do some work on these questions. What do you want those people to be doing? What are the big open questions on your mind here?
Well, look, if this is the approach you're going to take, you're going to say, okay, like the world is going to transform very quickly in the near future, which we both believe it is. But we have a lot of knowledge about how to deal with questions of the type that we expect to face. There's like an infinite number of actual policy problems to answer, and it's like ranges from questions like what should the tax base and optimal tax rate be in an AI economy? And there are people who are like trying to answer these questions, but mostly they're not sophisticated AI thinkers, and mostly a bad idea. At least like the stuff Simon mentioned before, this idea about compute taxes. Bernie Sanders has this idea of expropriating 50% of the stock of the major labs to try avoid, kind of gradual disempowerment, I guess, of the people who lose their jobs. And those are like bad policy ideas under the standard analysis of the liberal toolkit for all kinds of boring reasons. Like you don't want your tax base to be narrow. You don't want to have leakage out into other kinds of sectors. You don't want to make a bad bet where like frontier intelligence gets commoditized and the labs will go bankrupt. And now it's like all the returns, all the gains are going to NVIDIA, but you forgot to tax NVIDIA. And so there's like a bunch of like extremely important, but like kind of mundane policy design questions to answer. But then there's also like a bunch of like more galaxy brain, like science fiction, but still very much within the paradigm of the liberal toolkit for things you want to answer. So like one really important one is if you think AIs are going to be, if you think they ought to be market participants and democratic participants, there's like all kinds of infrastructure questions you have to answer about that, which is like, what even is an AI? Like, what's the relevant unit of AI stuff that can hold property or make a contract? Is it like Claude Opus 4.8, like the model, like the abstract entity, all the instances? Should we be thinking more at the level of chat threads? Maybe that's probably not right because AI, like AIs can duplicate subagents, and the subagents are going out and acting on that. So it's like questions that go to like the philosophy of like identity, but also just to ordinary incentive design. Like what kind of collection of stuff are you going to wrap legal identity around? How do you roll that over into questions about franchise? Like we have a naive idea of one person, one vote in the US, I think probably most democracies. That's not strictly speaking true, even in the US. Like it's true you get to vote for a senator, but then your senator gets like many more implicit votes if you're from Montana than if you're from California. And you can have all kinds of mechanism design that shifts and splits up AI political power in ways that would be designed to respond to worries about disempowerment of humans by an overwhelming number of AIs. And you can there's millions and millions of questions like this, that we think are just totally unsolved because the paradigm is sort of underinvested.
I'll just add on the methodological side, I think what long-termism really needs more of, we need more normal science macro strategy. Too much macro strategy work right now is trying to invent paradigms and thinking big picture. What we need is normal science where I think, and trusting. I think people need to be trusting existing social science. And we need lots of papers where someone takes a specific model of one of these phenomena we've already talked about, like model of market concentration or of externalities, and apply the model to the case of the far future rather than doing bespoke model creation from scratch. I think that's what would be very exciting to see. Is I'd like to see I'd love to see a lot of boring papers that I don't want to read because they're formulaic. That's what we need more of, I think.
Yeah, like Brookings paper.
Yeah, they should turn to the Dyson swarm next. I guess you're saying the subject matter can be, science fictional in some sense, or really take seriously wild futures, but the approach, frameworks, methodologies, these are already pretty well established. Let's kind of actually trust them rather than reinventing the wheel.
And they're going to be boring in the sense that I'm going to have to read stuff about the federal code and agency authority and I have to read a model of data center growth under various tax bases. And it'll be a slog. It'll be a real slog. It'll be sci-fi stuff. It's gonna be okay, how much matter is there in the solar system is going to be premise one, but then the rest of it. And one thing I really like about your work, Finn and Will's, is you have this kind of stuff in your papers. You have these sci-fi premises, but then you give us these models and we have to slog through them and see if they're correct. I think that's good. I think we should have a lot of sloggy models in sci-fi-ish papers, and the sloggy model should look as familiar to economists and political scientists as possible.
Amen. Let me ask one more question, and you're welcome to pass. What comes to mind if I ask you where you might be wrong? What kind of worries you? What feels like, any kind of potential gaps?
Yeah, I mean, one big worry I have is, these institutions, while we, the paper says liberalism forever, and the future is going to be very big and very different. And a big question is whether you even can have these things through the transition period. So, some parts of liberalism seem to scale quite readily. Many markets seem to scale quite readily. I don't know, stock market, you can do nanosecond stock transactions now in a way, the speed of that market is limited, it seems, mostly by physics at this point. Agency rulemaking in the federal government doesn't seem very much like that. And so it could be the case that while kind of a broadly liberal democratic system for governing markets is what we ought to have through the AGI transition into the future. It could be that that's just like impossible. It could be that like the institutional arrangement we have now charts no path from here to the post AGI future. So that's one big worry. I don't know what to do about that. I don't know what to say about it. Like that's a pessimistic view writ large. Like I'm not sure. I mean, this is a place where I think like if you really believed it, you could make an argument for a kind of swift transition to autocracy. You know, like democracies in fact do this sometimes. Like faced with extreme emergencies, like they famously have mechanisms for declaring emergency authority, which bypasses the slow and more democratic systems. Now, I think there are many reasons to think that's extremely high risk as a path to take. Like we have important historical examples of it going very badly. But it's a place where, like, I think we should be really trying to figure out, number one, how to make the democratic institutions scale really rapidly, and two, figuring out, like, if we don't think that's possible, what the least bad alternative is.
Okay, so there's the arguments for markets, there's the arguments for democracy. Of the arguments for markets, I am very high confidence of the argument for allocative efficiency because that's extremely foundational stuff in welfare economics. Overall, meaning I'm confident that that's the right way to be assessing markets. Given that, the relevant questions are really about market failures, if you want to be vindicating markets. So what I'm much less confident of is, well, hold on, maybe there will be really bad market concentration in the far future. So that's a hard question to analyze. And then, will we be able to address externalities in the far future? Will they get insuperably bad? That's a hard question to analyze. I feel very confident that transaction costs will fall relative to now in the far future. Besides from allocative efficiency at a time, then there's the innovation arguments for markets about dynamic effects. I'm more confused about those compared to allocative inefficiency. On the democracy side, I'm more worried about the exhaustiveness of the taxonomy of the arguments, whereas on the market side, I feel it's pretty clear. And then there, I guess, yeah, I'm unsure about whether democracies will in the long run robustly produce public goods better. And unsure on the commitment device stuff. I think the basic logic of it being a commitment device is very strong, but I guess I do worry that maybe dynamics with AI mean that like commitment won't matter in the future because like it just the AIs will dominate or something. So that's an interesting dialectic. And then I'm a bit confused about error correction because I don't feel I have a micro model of it. And similarly with pluralism and moral progress and stuff, that gets a bit mumbo jumbo for me. And then I get confused about whether the taxonomy is exhaustive on democracy. Those are the main dimensions of uncertainty for me.
Okay, great. Well, it remains to say, this listeners may not. This will be my last ForeCast interview, and what a joy to do it with you both. So yeah, thank you both so much. This is really great.
It's an honor to send you off, and best of luck.
Thanks so much.